afternoon to you all. Welcome to this session, Financing Resilience, Growth and Shared Prosperity. When I was invited to moderate this debate and I looked at the brief, I was reminded of that old saying, it takes two to tango. And I thought the managing director of the IMF yesterday illustrated it very, very clearly. She spoke about the fact that we've got growth in the south and the capital is in the north. And she spoke about building bridges to enable the two, shall we say, in this language, to tango. So here we are today to talk about some of the potential solutions on how we can enable that. I wanted to tell you also at the beginning that our debate is going to be in two parts. The first part is going to speak to the issues, to illustrate the extent of the problems that we are facing. And I think we've all been talking about these problems. We're talking about low growth in developing countries. We're talking about high inflation. We're talking about high unemployment. In the second part, we are going to be talking the solutions. How do we help the latent growth that we know is in the South to become a reality? Let me introduce my panelists. Immediately next to me, we have Mr. Alvaro Lario. He's president of the International Fund for Agriculture Development. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much.
A round of applause for him. Thank you. Next to him is Dr. Rania Al-Mashat. She's Minister of International Cooperation, Egypt. Next to her is Kenji Okamura, International Monetary Fund Deputy Managing Director. Next to the DMD is Kevin Chika Urama, Chief Economist, African Development Bank. And last but not least, Mr. Mohamed Hetiti is Chief Operating Officer, OCP Africa. DMD, I'm going to start with you.
Get my bag back. I just deposited to my staff, to my bag, and I need that bag to staff.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm starting with you still. I'm not going to change.
Okay.
And I really, as I said at the beginning, what we want to do is to outline the extent of the problem. So I'd like you, if you can, to speak to how low-income countries have fared since the start of COVID-19, and also how they have weathered the various shocks that have come through the systems. And then if you can as well, if you can contrast the impact that have been visited upon them versus developing and developed countries.
Okay, thank you, Godfrey. Good question. I will try my best to set a good stage to frame the discussion of our panel. So let me start. Low-income countries and the risks have been hardest hit by the massive and multiple shocks of the past few years. And this reflects two factors. One is the harm to growth and the reduced ability to respond. Let me start with this harm to growth. This one is significant scaling. So compared to pre-pandemic trends, I, at the fund, estimate that the cumulative real GDP loss between 2020 and 23 in RICS is more than 6% on average. And this 6% GDP loss is about five times more than in the advanced economies. And this scaling will have long-standing negative effects with projected growth below the pre-pandemic path for a prolonged period of time. This tells us that the prospect for income convergence, catching up, have diminished. The hope has been diminished. So, and this brings me to my second point. The policy space to respond is severely constrained.
Sure.
So this, but government support in response to recent shocks severely eroded fiscal and foreign exchange reserve buffers. At the same LICs face a high debt burden, huge development needs, and a historic funding squeeze. For the African continent, the financing need for LICs is estimated at $225 billion over the medium term. So currently, more than half of LICs are already in debt restrict or at high risk of debt distress. So the more than half are already in or at high risk of debt distress. So that means they are confronted with high debt service and limited sources of new financing. New financing is quite limited. So it is clear that LICs face significant challenges. So today's discussion is very important and timely to understand how us, the international community, can help those LICs. So I look forward to hearing the insights of the members of this distinguished panel. So I stop here and back to you, Godfrey.
I'm certainly looking forward to it, and I certainly hope we'll be able to come up with those solutions. Let me come to you, Professor Urama. You are on the ground on the African continent, and you deal with some of the poorest countries in the world. So I wanted to know from you how worried you are about the outlook for low-income countries. I remember listening to one session, and one of the questions that was asked was, are we headed for another debt crisis amongst poor countries?
Thank you very much for that question. From the African perspective, we see a very cautious optimism. That cautious optimism stems from the fact that despite the confluence of all the shocks that's already been elaborated, African economies are growing at 3.8% as at 2022, and projected to grow at like 4.4% or 4.1% from 2024 going forward. If you look at all the other macroeconomic fundamentals, we're seeing the economies returning to a pre-pandemic growth rates. And this is significant given that a lot of the issues, the lack of fiscal space, the tightening of the global financial conditions, the deepening of debt crisis in the continent, but the continent still continues to maintain some level of resilience. So that gives me some level of optimism. But the other source of optimism is also looking at the transitions we're in now in terms of the green transitions and the amount of green minerals that are domiciled in this continent called Africa, where we have 65% of arable land remaining on the continent. So the future of food will be defined by how Africa utilizes that arable land, and over 30% of green minerals are found on the continent. So the future of green transitions also depends on how Africa utilizes that. So having said all those, it doesn't mean that there are no concerns on the continent. The concerns are deriving from slow growth globally, and also weak institutions and subdued private consumption and private sector investments on the continent. So this leads to low industrial production and growth on the continent, and of course, poor structural transformation that is required for us to have growth in a sustained level. And we also know that that 3.8%, though we celebrate it at being above the global average, is not sufficient to create enough jobs, the quality of types of jobs that we need, and sustained growth that is required. We need to double that growth levels for able to be able to move forward. So the continent continues to struggle under the general subdued growth projections we have around the world and in these export markets, but also the high interest rates that is exacerbating debt repayment costs on the continent. Currently, the continent is spending over 11% of gross government revenue to be able to address just debt repayments alone. But that fundamental lack of investment in industrial production is leading the continent to continue to depend on commodity markets, which is always volatile, and that leads to challenges with regard to how the future of the continent might look. So, and again, the final point I'll raise is the physical risks of climate change, which is creating a lot of fiscal risks on the continent, but also transition risks that is emerging as policies for green transitions are evolving, and the continent doesn't have such technologies that are required for doing that. So in this point of turning point where we're having significant challenges on the continent, but the continent is like the next growth pole of the world. My question to us as a panel will be, how do we leverage these opportunities for shared prosperity, both in Africa and also to support global green transitions and the growth we all want to see?
How do we build that bridge in a fragmenting world? Absolutely important question. Let me come to you, Mr. Hetiti. We have seen a deterioration of food security across the world, but I think in particular for many, many, many low-income countries. You are an expert in a key component for the ability of ourselves to feed ourselves, which is, of course, fertilizer. And you are extensively involved. Personally, I think I saw your bio around the African continent, working with farmers. So I wanted to get your view on the outlook for food security, but I wanted to share with you a little tidbit. In my language, we say, "Unofane nyota makumbo ari mumvura," which means we Africans are like that guy who's standing in the middle of the river, but he's thirsty. How can that be possible when we have the 65% of arable land the professor spoke about?
Thanks. So, for the recent shocks, such as COVID-19 pandemic and also the geopolitical situations, the food security and the food sovereignty become in the front of the global discussions. So the issue here is not only for Africa, it's for the world. It's generic and it's systemic. So yeah, we are aligned that it's where more field for the low-income country dependent on importing food and energy. So the farmer in your village, my brother, when he's looking for the affordability and the availability for the fertilizer. And to face that in the global distribution for the markets, for us, as Africans, it's easy. That's because we need only to leverage on the local resources that we have. But in France, we need to make all the investment that it's needed for the whole value chain.
Sure.
So I will share with you number more than you share with us. So if we need only to meet the Abuja targets, what was 50 kg per hectares for fertilizer, we need an additional product, an additional volume for the fertilizer, 7 million tons. Now, if we need to reach the average for the world, we need additional 20 million tons for fertilizer. Sure. So the total is 27. How we can do it? It's easy if we are joining our hands together, if we are investing for the whole value chain. And this is our responsibility. You know, we have all the local resources needed to produce this fertilizer to at least supply the African markets.
Sure.
If we are not saying to supply the rest of the world. So for that, if I'm speaking about my company, OCP, we started that many years ago. Now we are at 15 million tons per year. And not only that, we have a capacity up to 1.2 million tons in the blending capacity in African country. I'm speaking about Nigeria, Ivory Coast, Senegal, Rwanda, and Ethiopia. So this capacity, yeah, we are supplying 65% of the markets, but it's not sufficient. That's why we are asking all the others to get their hands with us to invest more on the projections of the fertilizer. Yeah, I will not forget the ambitious program that we have $14 billion to reach 20 million tons per annum in the production capacity, but also to not forget to produce ammonia from the renewable energy that will give us a sustainable investment that we can ensure an affordable and available. It's more important that because in the countryside, the farmer, they are asking for the affordable products, but they are more asking on the availability of the products.
Sure.
So if we are joining our hands together, we can get this the fertilizer at the right time, at the right price, and the right place, but at the right quality. And I want to emphasize something very important here. It's time that we accelerate this adoption for specialized fertilizer. That's because it will allow the farmer to reduce his costs and increase his income. Reduce his costs, that because we'll apply only the quality that we need for the crops, but also increase his income. That's because the yield will increase. But the more important thing, he will keep his asset, the unique asset that is the land, for himself and for the kids that they are coming after.
Yeah, so we spoke about the growth. The growth is clearly there, right? No question. I must say, if I were a business person, I'd love to be in your position. No question about it, because you also have the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, which is making it even easier for you to be able to conduct your business. Thank you, sir, for that intervention. If I can come to you, Mr. Lario. Now, you are dedicated to eradicating hunger, and you work across the world. So I want to talk a little bit about, perhaps from your perspective, the policy priorities that you see countries facing, and also how to address the multiple shocks that we are seeing. There was one session yesterday that I was listening in, and one of the comments made by a participant was that we keep talking about shocks, but it's no longer about shocks, because these are becoming regular. This is the new normal. How do we fix that?
Well, thank you very much. Indeed, I think the colleagues have mentioned we are living in a very different world than 3 years ago in terms of inflation, cost of debt, level of debt, fiscal space, and we're also seeing hunger very much once more rising after 3-4 decades of just coming down. For us, it's not about subsistence farming, it's about investing actually in productive assets, in investable assets, and focusing on those marginalized communities that are in the rural areas where poverty is. Because of the Ukraine war, we have seen an awareness in many countries that food sovereignty, which was not a key issue. If you think about it, in Europe, it's a key national security issue. In the US, it's a national security issue. In many other areas of the world, it has not been. And actually, there have been commitments in the continent, in Africa, of governments already in 2003 to invest 10% of their GDP in agriculture, and that has not happened. If we think about the response globally of the G7 to the crisis, and the food crisis has been a 5 billion response. ODA in agriculture and food systems every year is 10 billion. This is not enough. It's very clear there has been a massive underinvestment in the rural areas, massive underinvestment if you want to create the value chains for having people to actually have a decent income. So this is the start. We're seeing a fragmentation in SDG 2. There's lots of coordination mechanisms, but there's very little money, as I was saying, Operationally, we have made progress, and this is the national pathways. We have now put together what are in each country, what are the needs, and the analysis. We're very good at analyzing. Now we need also the financing. We have also in Africa, with African Development Bank, put together the investment compacts. Once more, these are great analysis. Now we need the financing to also follow through. So the data, the analysis is there. The IMF has put together the food shock window, which is another good initiative. We have the intention to also increase some of the MDB capitals. At IFAD, we have a replenishment this year, whereby we are trying to increase the income of 110 million small-scale farmers. So there's the initiatives. The funding is, though, not following. It hasn't been a priority, I would say, for the international community to have this funding. So how do we go from this policy to the action? What does this mean in practice for the countries? First, more local production, being able to diversify crops, being less reliant on external shocks, more local food sovereignty. And this needs to be adapted to the local conditions. The second one is integration of regional markets. You were mentioning the African continental free trade. It's a national security for many blocks in the world, so you have to also integrate regional markets and include climate adaptation into your interventions. As you said, we're seeing more recurrent extreme weather events. We cannot wait. Small-scale farmers cannot wait for us to decide what do we do. The financing for the floods, for the droughts, for the cyclones, for the extreme heat needs to come now. So that's another important part. And one thing that many times we forget in all of these investments is that it's great to build the hard infrastructure, but this needs to trickle down to where the poverty is, which actually is in the last 10 mile. And this only happens if you create the conditions and the ecosystem to actually have these investments in a way that they become productive assets. Not aid, not food aid, just investable assets along the value chain. So not only food production or productivity, food distribution, food marketing, food commercialization, creating this environment. And for that, you need also to bring the private sector, not the multinationals, but actually the local private sector. You have agricultural development banks who are very big in many countries. You have local public development banks. You need to integrate things so that you can finance a lot of these activities. I'll leave it here. Thank you.
I wanted to remind you that we are trying to build bridges, so maybe we need the multinational companies as well.
Yep.
But I think I get your point. Thank you very much for that contribution. Minister, you are our sole policymaker here today, so we are going to make you the last speaker. And you have been dealing with multiple shocks that you have dealt with as a government, and you have seen this impact on emerging market countries as well as other developing economies. So I wanted to ask you, how do you see this impacting the ability of governments in these countries to implement the SDGs? Should we even be talking about them?
No, I don't think we should stop talking about them, because in 2015, when countries came together to agree on from MDBs to SDGs, it was creating a common denominator across all countries, so that no poverty, no hunger, gender, renewable, and all of these, the 17 goals, are so important to keep the consensus on goals. This is very, very important. Yes, the consecutive shocks have pushed us away from the trajectory that was, still there was a gap before 2020. And everybody was saying, oh, a decade away, and how are we supposed to, close this gap? And then the shocks that happened afterwards exacerbated this gap and created more challenges that need financing. That said, in designing national strategies that include cooperation across all my fellow panelists, be it multilateral development banks, specialized agencies, the private sector that becomes very key in trying to close these SDG gaps is the only way forward. So no, I don't think that we should ignore the SDGs. We should keep on pushing them forward, but we have to be realistic on what we are requesting from countries. And here let me tie this to the importance of having country ownership in the dialogue between the different fora that we attend. So for example, in our case, we have national strategies. They're very country-led. When I'm sitting with my group of bilateral development partners or multilateral development partners, we try and map how our national goals meet the global goals so that all of us at the end of the day want to push an agenda forward. Nonetheless, food security, water security, climate action. These are three words that are so intertwined, but cannot be ignored. Today, in order to have, whether it's a human capital project or an infrastructure project, you cannot escape the element of green. You cannot escape the element of digital. You cannot, escape the element of inclusion, be it youth or women. So all of these words, they are not slogans. They come down at the end into very specific projects and KPIs linked to projects. With IFAD, for instance, we have very important projects in rural areas, smallholder farmers, as was mentioned. You go from subsistence to production, and there's the sustainability of this. Another important aspect with the African Development Bank, which has so much experience within the continent, there is also a lot of South-South cooperation and triangular cooperation. The good projects that we've done in one country, how can we replicate them in other countries to, reduce the cost of preparation and to reduce, there are lots of benefits of trying to replicate successful example in other countries, particularly when we are, continuing to face shocks over and over. So, country ownership is important. Inclusive partnerships are important. Alvaro mentioned that the ODA, percent of ODA that goes into different aspects of SDG financing is actually coming down. It's a big number, but it's coming down over the years. And if we, want different countries to move forward, the different initiatives in MDBs, African Development Bank is venturing with SDRs to be able to move, create more financing for different goals. Very, very important to push that. IFAD is going through a replenishment exercise, needs a lot of financing to be able to, again, address not just the local challenges in countries, but again, the SDGs bring us back to the global goals. So what you're trying to do nationally definitely resonates with the global goal, and that's why the design is at a country level, but the impact is at a global level. And this is why we should not see them as mutually exclusive and it's either or. They come together, and that's the spirit of the annual meetings here in Marrakesh, where all of us are together to basically try and figure out how we can close these gaps.
And thank you very much for hosting us here for the first time, as everybody is saying, for the first time in 50 years. The IMF annual meetings have come to Africa here in the Kingdom of Morocco. So, Professor, I'm going to start with you in terms of the solutions, because your job is to find solutions, isn't it? And in the context of building bridges, I wanted to ask for your priorities. If you were to give your wish list, let's put it that way, for international partners in terms of what you see as priorities, what would you list those as?
Thank you very much. First, I would start by encouraging African countries and countries in the low-income countries group to always consider the fact that to be able to attract finance, we need good governance, and we need the environment that allows financing to be able to come to our countries. We need the projects, we need the long-term plans, like what Minister Rania has shared with us. But we also need to boost our own domestic capacity to mobilize revenue, because that helps us to be able to implement projects when they do come. But for the international community, for me, if I'm talking to multilateral development banks, since we are in the World Bank, IMF annual meetings, I would say that we need to expand significantly concessional financing and grants that goes to countries in order to allow them to be able to build, or let me say, de-risk the public space and allow the private sector to be able to come in greatly. But we also need to provide more risk-agnostic and catalytic capital. Of course, we're doing risk guarantees now, but we need to do a lot more of that, because what I see as being able to fill the gap between billions and trillions required is catalyzing the private sector. And that de-risking instruments will help to do that quite a lot going forward. But all the innovative financing instruments that are coming up and being discussed, sustainability-linked loans, and also green bonds and so on are good to explore, but the only proviso I put there is that despite the promise we see that many climate vulnerable countries and low-income countries don't have the capacity to access that. So we need to rethink generally how the architecture is, the global financing architecture, so that we can align with vulnerability and need much more than these risk-based assessments of where financing flows to, and adopt more of a system-wide development transitions programs instead of project-by-project basis. So that way we can help to de-risk private sector risks in those portfolio of projects, but also allow for transformative impacts to happen. And more generally, how we use our risk capital to catalyze the private sector will remain the key for us to be able to move from billions to trillions that is required to be able to move forward. And then the credit rating agencies, my appeal would be to actually review the methodologies on how these risk ratings are done, because on the continent of Africa, the continent is losing about $74.5 billion US annually because of poor ratings and perceptions about ratings. And when you look at the studies available with regard to default rates on long-term infrastructure financing, the continent is not doing badly. So there seems to be some risk perception that doesn't actually match a lot of the realities that we have going forward. And the lowest hanging fruit for me of mobilizing capital at scale is the SDR rechanneling, which the Minister Rania has talked about, President Adesina has been talking about, and the Inter-American Development Bank have worked with us and also IMF on the models for doing this, because that will help the developing, the regional development banks like AFDB to be able to leverage that capital a lot more, almost by 4 times. So if 250 billion were rechanneled, that means we're almost getting to that 1 trillion in terms of money that's available for countries. Now, the African Development Bank has been leading quite a lot of innovations in this area, and because of the time on the panel, I may not be able to go into depth with it.
I was actually going to ask you to give a few examples, just a couple of examples in terms of the work that you are doing, given we are here and there are people who are listening to you who want to hear what you are doing before they see how they can commit and help you.
Okay, thank you very much for that time. One of the first things we talked about, the risks of inflation, interest rate, debt, and other things, borders around the public financial management capacity of countries. So the first thing we did when we saw the pandemic emerging was to establish a public financial management academy, which we are running with the World Bank, with the IMF, and colleagues from OECD and everywhere to help build the capacity of countries all through the cycle, from domestic revenue mobilization to expenditure planning and management, sustainable borrowing, and debt management and other things. This remains critical because the capacities of the institutions we have in these countries shapes how they relate with the global environment. And we can't overstate the need for building those capacities going forward. But also I've talked about the SDL rechanneling, which we have been discussing. And for me, that's a key thing that needs to be done. But several other things like the hybrid capital, synthetic securitization. There are so many work that's going on in the innovative financing area that the African Development Bank has been working with other MDBs and other DFIs on.
I realize I may need to give you more time, which I don't have, so thank you very much. But you'll see as well that I steered very clear of the issue around the rating agencies, because that is another day and another conversation. Mr. Lario, can I come to you again, leaning on your experience in working in rural areas with poor communities and in countries, in low-income countries. So my question to you is, at that country level, what kind of policies do we need to implement so we're able to get higher growth that is sustainable and also that is inclusive?
Thank you very much. So I'll just focus very briefly on the challenge. The challenge is for all of us as an international community on how we're going to produce more food by 2050, around 50, 70%, in a more environmental friendly way when you're having all of the extreme weather events, and also more nutritious food. So this is a challenge for the globe as such. So for us, the solutions or the answers to that start, as you have mentioned, and some of the colleagues, first with people. I mean, the return on social inclusion, on stability, on improving livelihoods, on just hope, when you are actually targeting and supporting the livelihoods and increasing the income of those that are left behind, I think that's very important. For us, that means small-scale farmers, which actually in the world, the ones under 2 hectares produce around 1/3 of the food, under 5 hectares, 50%. In Africa or in Asia, 70% of the food is produced by these very small-scale farmers, which many times are the ones who are going hungry, and they don't have the ability of getting the income. So no wonder that people want to sometimes leave the sector. I think the second one, and the colleague from African Development Bank was mentioning, being creative on financial instruments. And I think perhaps we need to go from single billions to tens of billions, but the debt the swap debts that are happening, including on nature or others on energy, like in Egypt, I would say SDR rechanneling very clearly. I think we need to try to use, or I feel responsible where I'm sitting now, to try to not only do public sector loans, but catalyze the private sector. At IFAD, concretely, we got a credit rating, the first United Nations agency to get a credit rating, a AA+. We have started for the first time to integrate private sector into our core operations. We all need to evolve, that's very clear. And then it was also mentioned, but it's very important, the country ownership. It's fundamental, where in our case, it's farmers' organizations, local governments, they have weak institutional capacity in many of these fragile affected countries. It's the responsibility also of the international community to support in building this capacity at that institutional level. And the ownership. Without the ownership of the countries, it's not sustainable. We can intervene, but it will not be sustainable. And finally, I think for us, specifically on food, means on-farm jobs, which is very much to agriculture, but as I mentioned, also off-farm jobs. That's where the value addition, I would say the bigger income can come for many of these countries, and obviously people would rather stay where they are if they had this ability of having a decent livelihood and leading good lives, and that's what we need. This will create more stability, less conflict, less forced migration. So this localization of SDGs is fundamental.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. Spoken with heart. Thank you, sir. Mr. Hetiti, if I can come to you. I'm looking at my clock, and I'm going to ask you to compress your thoughts a little bit, but in part because the next question is a little uncomfortable for me as a journalist, because I am almost like asking you to speak to your book, the role of the private sector in all of this.
So you cannot give me the opportunity and restrict me on the time. It will be difficult for me. It will be difficult for me to short, but I will try to summarize. In crisis period, private sector has a major role to overcome the challenges. First, that's because he can act rapidly. Second, he has the capability to assess the challenge and overcome them with targeted actions. But also, he has this agility to adapt his operations to the situation. This is the strength for the private sector. And I will start with the first one, the urgent actions. Throughout an example that OCP did when the geopolitical situation changed in the beginning in 2022. So OCP decided immediately to make available 550,000 tons of fertilizer to the African farmer. 180 was as the donations, and the remaining quantity was a discounted price. And we didn't limit ourselves to that, but working with international institutions, World Bank, USAID, we ensure that this product meets or reach the smallholder farmer that was in the need. So that was our urgent actions for the holistic approach to and sustainable project to contribute to development of the agriculture. We already started since 2016, maybe before, many programs. The first one was this OCP School Lab, where we are training the farmer. We have this mobile track, training the farmer and giving them the information about their soil. And I remember the time when I was in Kaduna and one farmer came to me, thanks to bring us back to the school, and how you can now better our soil than us. We just bring technology. That's because we bring with us laboratory and we were testing the soil. So we show them that we can, with technology, we can understand more the soil. And we have the other programs, AgriBooster, where we are trying to gather all the stakeholders around the farmers, input suppliers, off-taker, but also the finance part, the bank, to allow the farmer to invest and to invest in agriculture and getting better yield means better revenue. We have also these 5,000 that we start installing this year, 5,000 demo plots to show the farmer on the ground how the comparison between different practices, but also the differences between different inputs. So throughout this program, we reach more than 2.5 million farmers, and we map more than 50 million hectares in Africa. But also we develop more than 40 formula adapted to the local users. And lastly, but not the least, we invest on the downstream value chain where in the model commercial farm. That's because, we have smallholder farmer, but we need to increase the yield. That's why we invest in this model commercial farms, more than 5,000 in Ivory Coast and in Nigeria.
And I knew it was going to be difficult to stop you, but I hear you. And I think the point is very, very well made.
But
the
very important part, that's because it's
one last part.
The very important part, and my colleagues speak about it, is the investments. And you give me the opportunity to announce that yesterday we start the financial blended platform for Africa, where we gather all the stakeholders. We are asking for the others to join us, and the objective is to raise $800 million by 2030, targeting 30 value chain in Africa throughout 60 agro chain deal. Thank you.
Opportunities, opportunities, opportunities. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much. Minister, if I can come to you, and I'm feeling slightly guilty as well because I'm asking you to speak to your book. How do you work with those partners that you require? How do we develop the relations that we need better with bilateral partners? Number one, you engage in international relations. And then, of course, the multilateral institutions such as the IMF and the World Bank for us to be able to attain our goals.
Very briefly, three principles. Commitment, the government's commitment to certain goals. Clarity with the projects, and clarity with who has a comparative advantage to partner with us on these projects. And third, credibility. We have credibility with the international community given the very important and significant work that has happened over the past many years. So for any partnership to be successful, there has to be commitment to what is it that we want to do and what to achieve. All of this has to translate in action into projects or programs. And then you need the financing, you need the technical assistance, you need the engagement, and that only happens if you're a credible and trusted partner, and this is on both sides. I go to IFAD because we have done very good work in the past. I wanted to be our partner of choice. IFAD would want to work with Egypt because we had successful programs, and when we go to the board, we are able to say that as well. Similarly with the African Development Bank, if we're talking about water treatment plants, if we're talking about SMEs, private sector, and so forth. So I think these are the principles of engagement, and then the overarching umbrella, if you will, are the principles of global partnership for effective development cooperation from OECD. Again, country ownership, inclusive partnerships, always being driven by results, and we have to report on these results. And then finally, accountability and transparency.
Absolutely, building those bridges. Thank you very much. I mean, it's an incredible thing for you. I never thought I'd get a politician who comes and is succinct to the point and sticking to the time. Thank you, Minister. Totally appreciate it. DMD Okamura, I'm coming to you for the financing. The question has to be asked. You have various instruments that you've been using to try and mitigate some of these crises that we have been seeing. So let's speak about what the fund is doing. Number one. Number two, let's also speak about other innovations. You spoke about innovations that you are having to do in order to be able to attune to the current crisis that we have.
Okay. Thank you, Godfrey. very carefully I have heard our fellow panelists' discussion. It's very interesting. And I found we all agree that the scale of challenges of low-income countries at this shock-prone environment, this vast scale means that everyone needs to play their part. So, and your question just come to the market and what we at the fund are doing. So, for our part, the IMF is supporting the low-income countries, the LICs, through our three main activities. Policy advice, capacity development, and lending. Today, our fellow panelists discussed, the concessional lending provision is important, and SDL channeling, quite mentioned. So let me just focus on this lending out of these three main activities of the fund. Since the pandemic, there has been fivefold increase in our lending through the PRGT. PRGT, poverty reduction and growth trust. The centerpiece of our concessional financing. And annual PRGT lending has increased fivefold, as I said, from $1.7 billion per year before the pandemic to $8 billion this year. $8 billion this year. So to help the LICs, the fund fully deployed the existing lending toolkits and added new instruments. Three specifics. One, the fund rapidly provided emergency financing during the COVID-19 pandemic. Two, to cope with a global food crisis, we stepped up our lending, 14 new programs, and 5 existing programs augmented. And we established a food shock window that has so far benefited 5 low-income countries. And 3, we established the new Resilience and Sustainability Trust, RST, to help countries tackle the longer-term resilience building, such challenges as climate change and pandemics. To date, 11 programs under the RST was approved, and 6 out of these 11 is in Africa, and more to come. So we have deployed $1 billion. Sorry, big serious mistake. $1 trillion in global liquidity and reserves through our lending and the SDL allocation. And now, SDL channeling to low-income countries through our PLGT and the RST. So we have done a lot, but as we discussed today, LICs continue to have significant financing needs. So we are doing everything we can to secure adequate resources. Adequate resources to support low-income countries. Then I have a good news to share with you. We have heard earlier today during the high-level event on PLGT that we have made significant progress toward our $3 billion target for PLGT subsidy resources, including major contributions from Japan and Qatar. And I would particularly like to thank the large and diverse group of contributors, like Botswana and Mauritius.
Okay.
This, I think it's a good manifestation, testament of solidarity. So making these fundraising efforts a success. But there is more work to do, and the need of leaks remain vast. So I would say the need for international cooperation. The need for international cooperation has never been greater. So in the spirit of solidarity, we must continue to work together to help the low-income countries to ensure our most vulnerable countries do not have to face their challenges alone.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah, I stop here.
I think it's a great point to end the conversation. If you've got countries like Botswana, Mauritius, lifting up their hands and saying, let's help, I think it's a great point. Thank you, DMD Okamura. Thank you to all my panelists. Thank you to the audience for listening in. Please help me to thank them.